Story 1. The Party That Never Ends. The night was alive with energy, the kind that only comes once a year on New Year's Eve. Jake adjusted the collar of his jacket nervously as he stepped into the lavish penthouse party. The room shimmered with golden decorations, the soft hum of jazz mingling with the chatter of elegantly dressed strangers. It felt surreal, like stepping into a scene from a movie. Jake wasn't used to this kind of setting. He preferred quiet evenings at home, but his friend Liam had convinced him it was time to start the year differently. "You need to live a little, man," Liam had said, practically dragging him to the party. Jake scanned the room, feeling a little out of place. The space was packed with people laughing, clinking glasses, and exchanging stories as if they'd known each other forever. He noticed waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne, their movements almost too smooth, too perfect. The host of the party, a man in an ornate golden mask, stood near the center of the room. His presence was magnetic, his laugh deep and booming as he entertained a small group of guests. Jake felt the host's gaze sweep over him for a brief moment, and it sent a strange chill down his spine. Liam had disappeared into the crowd almost immediately, leaving Jake to fend for himself. He wandered toward the bar, hoping to calm his nerves with a drink. As he waited for the bartender, a stranger leaned in close. The man's face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Be careful," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the music. "This party isn't what it seems." Before Jake could respond, the man was gone, swallowed up by the sea of people. Jake tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. It was probably just some drunk trying to mess with him. After all, this was a party, a night for celebration, not paranoia. But as the night wore on, something felt off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the laughter seemed a little too loud, the smiles a little too forced. Every now and then, Jake caught the golden-masked host watching him from across the room. Each time, the host raised his glass and smiled, but it wasn't comforting. It felt like a warning. The countdown to midnight was fast approaching, and Jake decided he'd stick around until then and call it a night. But somewhere deep down, he couldn't shake the sense that he might not be leaving this party the way he planned. The energy in the room reached its peak as the clock struck 11:59 p.m. The host clinked a knife against his glass, the sharp sound cutting through the music and chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, gather round," he boomed, his voice commanding yet unnervingly calm. The crowd surged toward the center of the room, forming a tight circle around him. Jake found himself caught in the wave of people, his uneasiness growing. The host raised his golden mask slightly, just enough to sip from his glass, but not enough to reveal his face. "It's almost time," he said, smiling. His words sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Jake glanced at the massive clock hanging above the room, its hands inching closer to midnight. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The chant was loud, the voices merging into a near-deafening roar. Jake felt a strange sensation in his chest, like an invisible weight pressing down on him. He looked around, noticing for the first time how synchronized everyone was. Each person's voice was perfectly in time, their smiles eerily identical. 3, 2, 1. The crowd erupted in cheers, glasses clinking, and fireworks exploding outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jake tried to join in, forcing a laugh as he sipped his champagne, but something wasn't right. The clock above them, instead of moving forward, reset itself to 11:59 p.m. He blinked, sure it was a mistake. The host raised his glass again, that same unsettling smile plastered across his face. "Let's do it again," the host exclaimed, his voice echoing through the room. The crowd erupted into laughter, as if this was all part of the night's entertainment. The countdown began once more. 10, 9, 8. Jake's heart raced. He glanced at Liam, who stood nearby with a glazed expression, laughing and chanting along with the others. "Liam," Jake whispered, grabbing his friend's arm. "Did you see that? The clock—" "Relax, man," Liam said, brushing him off with a laugh. "It's just a gimmick. Stop being so uptight." But there was something hollow in Liam's voice, something mechanical about the way he spoke. Jake backed away, his pulse pounding in his ears. He scanned the room for an exit, but every door seemed farther away than it had before. The countdown ended again, cheers erupted, and the clock reset once more. 11:59 p.m. This time, Jake wasn't the only one who noticed. A woman near the bar caught his eye. She wasn't clapping or cheering. Instead, she stood frozen, her wide eyes darting between the clock and the crowd. She turned to Jake, her lips trembling as she whispered, "You see it too, don't you?" Before Jake could respond, the golden-masked host raised his hand, silencing the room with a single gesture. "Welcome," he said, his smile widening unnaturally, "to the night that never ends." Jake's mind raced as the golden-masked host's words hung in the air. The night that never ends. Around him, the crowd erupted into cheers again as if nothing unusual had been said. But he could feel the tension, a pressure in the air that made his skin crawl. The woman who had spoken to him moments earlier grabbed his arm. "We need to talk, now," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the host. The woman introduced herself as Eva and led Jake to a quieter corner near the bar. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I've been here for I don't know how long, days, weeks. The clock always resets before midnight, and the same people do the same things over and over." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "That's impossible. It's just a trick. Some kind of illusion," he stammered. Eva shook her head, her expression grim. "If it's a trick, it's a damn good one. I've tried to leave. There's no way out. The elevator doesn't work. The stairwell leads nowhere, and—" She hesitated, her voice dropping. "I've seen people try to leave. They disappear. Just gone." Jake's heart sank. He glanced back at the golden-masked host, who was laughing and clinking glasses with the guests. Something about him seemed off, his movements too smooth, his presence too commanding. Jake's uneasiness grew as the countdown began again. Eva grabbed his wrist. "Come with me," she said urgently. "I'll show you something." She led him to a heavy curtain draped against the far wall. Behind it was a small room, dimly lit and filled with strange, unsettling objects. Old photographs lined the walls, each one showing the same party. The guests were different in each photo, but the golden-masked host was always there, standing in the center with that same unsettling smile. The dates on the photographs went back decades, some even a century. Jake's breath hitched as Eva pointed to a handwritten note pinned to the wall. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. "The night never ends until one replaces the host. Beware the golden mask." "What does it mean?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. Eva swallowed hard. "I don't know, but I think the host is choosing someone to take his place." Before Jake could process her words, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them. He turned to see the golden-masked host standing in the doorway. "Ah, there you are," the host said smoothly, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Exploring my little secrets, are we?" Jake and Eva froze, fear rooting them to the spot. The host's smile widened as he stepped closer. "The clock is ticking," he said, gesturing toward the wall where another clock displayed 11:59 p.m. "Soon, it will be time to make a choice." Jake grabbed Eva's arm, pulling her toward the door. "Run," he whispered. The two of them bolted back into the main party. Jake's mind raced as he pushed through the oblivious crowd. The host's laughter followed them, echoing above the music. Jake glanced back and saw the host standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, his golden mask glowing faintly in the dim light. The countdown began once more. 10, 9, 8. But this time Jake wasn't sure they'd make it through the next cycle. The countdown echoed in Jake's ears like a drumbeat of dread. 7, 6, 5. He and Eva pushed through the crowd, their panicked movements at odds with the guests' synchronized cheers and laughter. Jake's mind was racing. He didn't know where they were going. He just knew they had to get away from the golden-masked host. 4, 3. The host's voice rose above the crowd, calm yet chilling. Running won't save you. The party finds everyone in the end. Jake risked a glance over his shoulder. The host was no longer standing in the middle of the room. He was moving through the crowd, his golden mask glinting as if it had a life of its own. The guests parted for him like a tide, their faces blank and eerily serene. "Where do we go?" Jake whispered to Eva, his voice barely audible over the chant. She shook her head. "I don't know. I've never gotten this far. We have to find something, anything that gets us out of here." They stumbled toward the far side of the room where the grand staircase spiraled down to the lower floors. Jake grabbed the banister and hesitated. The stairs looked endless, stretching down into darkness. "You said the stairs don't lead anywhere," he said, his voice trembling. Eva looked at him with desperation in her eyes. "It's better than standing here." Before they could decide, the host appeared at the top of the stairs, his mask now glowing with an unnatural golden light. "Leaving already?" he asked, his tone mocking. "The fun is just beginning." The countdown reached its final number. 1. The crowd erupted into cheers, and the clock reset to 11:59 p.m. As the cycle began again, the host took a deliberate step toward them, his movements unnervingly slow yet deliberate. "You've seen the truth now," he said, his voice resonating as if it came from everywhere at once. "One of you must take my place. It's the only way the party ends." Eva backed away, her face pale. "No, there has to be another way," she said, her voice cracking. "There isn't," the host replied simply. "This is how it has always been. One guest leaves, one stays forever." Jake's mind raced. The golden mask seemed to pulse, its glow intensifying as the host stepped closer. "Who will it be?" the host asked, his voice almost playful. Suddenly, Eva grabbed Jake's arm. "Go," she whispered urgently. "What?" Jake turned to her, confusion and panic written across his face. "Go," she yelled, shoving him toward the staircase. "If one of us has to stay, it's not going to be you. Just run." "No, we can both—" "Run, Jake!" Before he could argue, Eva charged toward the host. Her sudden movement seemed to catch him off guard. She grabbed the golden mask with both hands, pulling at it as the host let out a guttural, inhuman scream. The mask's glow intensified, filling the room with blinding light. Jake hesitated for only a moment before bolting down the stairs. The sound of the host's screams and Eva's desperate shouts echoed behind him, growing fainter with each step. The staircase seemed endless, but suddenly Jake found himself at the ground floor. The opulent party above was gone. He pushed through the heavy front doors and stumbled into the cold night air. The city was eerily silent, the streets deserted. Jake turned back to look at the penthouse, but it was no longer there, just an empty, darkened building that loomed over him like a shadow. He collapsed to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The party was over, or so he thought. Then, in the distance, he heard it, faint, familiar laughter and the sound of a countdown. 10, 9, 8. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun. Jake sat on the cold pavement, his chest heaving as he struggled to process what had just happened. The penthouse he had escaped from now stood dark and lifeless, its once vibrant windows empty, as though the party had never existed. His mind screamed for answers, but exhaustion and fear clouded his thoughts. The distant sound of laughter and the countdown. 7, 6, 5. echoed faintly through the quiet city streets, sending a chill down his spine. He pulled out his phone, desperate for some kind of connection to reality, but the screen was blank, unresponsive, as if the device had never been powered on. Jake's heart pounded as he realized he had no way of contacting anyone, no way of confirming where or when he was. His trembling hands shoved the phone back into his pocket. The streets around him were unnervingly silent, the air thick with a sense of wrongness. Jake rose to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady, and began to walk. The city seemed unfamiliar, the buildings taller, darker, their shapes distorted in the dim light of a hazy, unnatural glow. Each step he took felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted his movement. As he wandered, his thoughts returned to Eva. Her last words echoed in his mind. "Run, Jake." The image of her charging toward the golden-masked host, sacrificing herself to buy him time, twisted his stomach with guilt. He had no idea what had happened to her or what had become of the host. But deep down, he feared the truth. She had bought his freedom at a terrible cost. After what felt like hours of walking, Jake found himself back at his apartment building. Relief flooded him, though it was tinged with unease. The building looked normal, familiar, but something felt off. The lobby lights flickered faintly, and the elevator's usual hum was eerily absent. He decided to take the stairs to his unit, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the empty stairwell. When he reached his apartment door, he fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking. He stepped inside, closing and locking the door behind him. The silence of his apartment was a welcome change from the surreal chaos of the party. For a moment he allowed himself to believe it was over, but as he turned on the lights, his blood ran cold. A golden mask sat on his coffee table, gleaming softly under the dim overhead light. Beside it was a handwritten note on yellowed paper. His stomach churned as he read the words, "You cannot escape the party, the clock is ticking." The faint sound of a countdown began again, coming from somewhere inside his apartment. 10, 9, 8. Jake's eyes darted around the room, his pulse pounding in his ears. He rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The knob twisted uselessly in his grip. The countdown grew louder, the numbers reverberating through the walls. 5, 4. Jake turned, his back pressed against the door as the lights in the apartment began to flicker. 3, 2. The last thing Jake saw was his reflection in the golden mask, its surface now glowing with the same eerie light as before. 1. The room plunged into darkness. Somewhere, far away, the sound of laughter erupted once more, followed by the faint clinking of glasses and the cheerful hum of celebration. The party was starting again. And this time, Jake wasn't just a guest. He was the host. Story 2, The Forgotten Guest. The snowstorm outside roared like a restless beast, but inside the old countryside mansion, everything was warm and inviting. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the laughter and chatter of Clara's family. She sat quietly at the edge of the long dining table, watching her relatives drink and toast to the coming new year. Though surrounded by family, she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, like an outsider in her own home. It had been years since Clara had returned to the mansion, and much of it felt unfamiliar now. The towering ceilings seemed taller, the creaking wooden floors louder, and the family's traditions stranger than she remembered. She couldn't help but notice the extra place setting at the table. A pristine white plate and a gleaming silver goblet sat untouched, as though waiting for someone. "Who's that for?" Clara asked her mother, who was busy arranging the desserts. Her mother paused for a moment before smiling faintly. "It's tradition," she said, her tone dismissive. "Don't worry about it." Clara frowned. She didn't remember this tradition from her childhood, but before she could ask more, her younger cousins burst into the room, dragging her into their games and pulling her thoughts away from the strange detail. The night carried on, the laughter and music growing louder as the clock ticked closer to midnight. Yet, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every now and then, the flickering light of the fireplace cast odd shadows on the walls, and the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick slower than usual. She brushed off her unease, telling herself it was just her nerves. After all, it was just a family gathering. Nothing unusual about that. But when a knock echoed through the house, sharp and deliberate, Clara's heart skipped a beat. The room fell silent, the conversations and laughter abruptly cut short. No one was expecting anyone, not on a night like this, with the storm raging outside. Her mother exchanged a tense glance with her father, but neither moved to answer the door. Clara stood, her curiosity outweighing her unease. "I'll get it," she said, her voice breaking the silence. As she approached the heavy front door, the cold draft from outside made her shiver. With a deep breath, she pulled it open. Standing on the doorstep was a tall woman dressed in a long black coat, her face obscured by a thin veil. The stranger's presence felt wrong, though Clara couldn't quite explain why. "I'm here for the celebration," the woman said softly, her voice as cold as the air outside. "May I come in?" Clara hesitated, glancing back at her family, who were watching in silent discomfort. Something about the woman's voice made Clara's skin prickle, but she stepped aside, unsure how to refuse. "Of course," she said finally. The woman entered slowly, the weight of her presence pressing down on the room. She moved with an unsettling grace, her black coat trailing behind her like a shadow. The door closed with a soft thud, and the warmth of the mansion suddenly felt less comforting. Clara's mother gestured toward the table. "Please, join us," she said, her voice carefully polite. The woman sat at the extra place setting without hesitation, folding her hands neatly in her lap. As the family resumed their chatter, albeit more subdued now, Clara's unease deepened. The stranger didn't eat or drink. She simply sat there watching as though she were waiting for something. The clock struck 9, its chime reverberating through the room like a low warning. The stranger at the table hadn't said much, but her presence was impossible to ignore. Clara watched her closely, noting the way she barely moved. Her veiled face tilted ever so slightly toward the others as though she were studying them. The family's laughter was quieter now, their voices less carefree, as though an invisible weight had settled over the room. Clara leaned toward her mother. "Do you know who she is?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mother gave her a sharp look. "It's impolite to ask questions," she said, her tone firm and final. Clara's unease grew. The woman wasn't eating or drinking, and she seemed entirely uninterested in the celebration. Yet no one, not even her outspoken uncle or curious young cousins, had asked about her. It was as if they were all avoiding the subject, pretending she wasn't there. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling against the windows. As the family began a round of card games, the lights flickered once, then twice. The room fell silent and all eyes turned to the stranger. She didn't flinch or even seem to notice, sitting as still as a statue, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Probably the storm," Clara's father muttered, trying to dispel the tension. He shuffled the cards with a little more force than necessary, urging everyone to resume the game. As the minutes ticked by, Clara couldn't take her eyes off the woman. There was something deeply unsettling about her, something that made Clara's chest tighten every time she glanced her way. When the stranger finally spoke, her voice was so soft that Clara almost missed it. "This house is full of memories," the woman said, her words hanging in the air like frost. "Every corner holds a story." Clara froze. The way she said it made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. "How do you know that?" she asked, louder than she intended. The woman turned her veiled head toward Clara, her movements deliberate and slow. "I've been here before," she said simply. Clara's father coughed, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, it's an old house," he said with a forced chuckle. "Lots of history, I'm sure." But Clara couldn't let it go. "What do you mean you've been here before?" she pressed, ignoring the nervous glances her family exchanged. The stranger tilted her head as though considering the question. "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I remember it well." Before Clara could ask more, her younger cousin tugged on her sleeve. "Who is she?" the little boy asked, his voice innocent but trembling slightly. Clara didn't have an answer. She looked at the stranger again, but the woman had returned to her unnerving stillness. The air in the room felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves were leaning in. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the fire in the hearth flared up, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. A loud thud echoed from somewhere upstairs, causing everyone to jump. "What was that?" Clara's aunt asked, clutching her wine glass. No one answered. Clara's father stood, clearing his throat. "I'll check it out," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. As he left the room, the stranger's head turned toward the staircase, following his movements with a slow, deliberate motion. Clara's unease deepened, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. She couldn't shake the thought that the night was about to take a much darker turn. The thud from upstairs lingered in Clara's mind, each second of silence amplifying her unease. She sat frozen, her eyes darting between the staircase and the stranger at the table. The woman remained eerily calm, her veiled face tilted slightly upward as if she were still following Clara's father. The rest of the family murmured nervously among themselves, the earlier warmth of the evening now completely gone. Minutes ticked by, but Clara's father didn't return. "I'll go check on him," Clara said, standing abruptly. Her mother reached out to grab her arm, but stopped herself. The hesitation in her eyes was unmistakable. Clara felt her chest tighten. "Why is everyone acting like this is normal?" she said, her voice rising. "Who is she and what is going on?" "Enough, Clara," her mother snapped, her voice cold and sharp. "Sit down. Everything is fine." Clara stared at her mother, disbelief and anger swirling inside her. She turned away and started toward the staircase, her steps deliberate but cautious. The house was eerily quiet now, the muffled howling of the storm outside the only sound. As she ascended the creaking wooden stairs, the air grew colder, each breath turning to mist in front of her. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched out before her, dimly lit by flickering sconces. She called out softly, "Dad?" But her voice seemed to vanish into the heavy silence. Clara pushed open the door to her father's study. The room was dark, but moonlight streaming through the frosted window illuminated the old bookshelves and a large desk covered in papers. Her father was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Clara's eyes fell on a photograph lying on the desk. Its glass frame cracked. She picked it up with trembling hands. The black and white image showed a group of people standing in front of the mansion, their clothes dated and formal. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the veiled stranger standing among them, unchanged, her tall frame and dark coat unmistakable. "What the?" Clara whispered, her pulse quickening. Behind her, the floorboards groaned. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but the hallway was empty. She backed away, slowly, clutching the photograph to her chest. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, elongating unnaturally. Clara forced herself to move, her feet carrying her toward the staircase. As she descended, she heard faint whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, Clara froze. The stranger had risen from her seat and was now standing at the head of the dining table. The rest of the family sat motionless, their faces blank and pale, their eyes fixed on the table. No one reacted to Clara's return. The stranger turned her veiled face toward Clara. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said, her voice soft but commanding. Clara's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. What? What are you talking about? Where's my dad? The stranger took a slow step forward, her movements graceful but unnerving. Your father is where he needs to be, she said, her tone cold and final. He made his choice just as others have before him. What are you talking about? Clara shouted, her voice cracking. Who are you? What do you want? The stranger tilted her head as if considering the question. I've come to collect what is owed, she said simply. Clara's gaze darted to her family, who still sat frozen and silent. What did you do to them? She demanded, her voice rising with desperation. They understand, the stranger replied. It's you who must decide now. Will you resist, or will you accept the truth? The fire in the hearth flared up violently, casting distorted shadows across the room. Clara felt the weight of the stranger's words settle heavily on her chest, and for the first time, she realized she might not make it out of this night unchanged. Clara's heart pounded as she stared at the stranger. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Her family sat motionless, their faces blank and lifeless. Even the storm outside seemed to have quieted, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed on Clara's ears. What do you mean I must decide? Clara demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. The stranger moved closer, her veil shifting slightly with each step. Though her face was obscured, Clara could feel the intensity of her gaze. Every year this house calls me, the woman said, her voice soft yet commanding, to remind your family of the debts they owe. Some accept it willingly, others need persuasion. Clara felt her legs weaken. Debts? What are you talking about? We don't owe you anything. The stranger stopped, tilting her head slightly. Not you, perhaps, but your bloodline. Generations before you struck a bargain to preserve this family's fortune, to protect this house. A debt was sealed, and I am here to collect. Clara's mind raced, trying to process the stranger's words. It sounded impossible, like something out of a nightmare. No, she said firmly, shaking her head. You can't just take people. That's not how the world works. The stranger's veiled head turned toward Clara's uncle, who sat pale and trembling at the table. Your father understood, the stranger said, her voice low and steady. He went willingly, and now it's your turn to decide. Who will carry the weight of this bargain? Clara's stomach turned. You're lying. My dad wouldn't agree to anything like this. The stranger extended a gloved hand toward Clara. He understood the price. He chose to protect you as a father should. But the debt does not end with him. Someone must take his place. The house demands it. The room seemed to darken further, the flickering firelight casting grotesque shapes on the walls. Clara's breathing grew shallow. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't be happening. The stranger turned toward the rest of the family, who sat as if in a trance. Or perhaps, she said, her tone sharper now, you would prefer that the house chooses for you. No, Clara shouted, stepping forward. Stop this. The stranger stood still for a moment, then extended her gloved hand toward Clara. Then it is your choice to make. Stand in his place or walk away and let the house decide. Clara's thoughts spun. She felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in around her. Her family remained frozen, helpless, and the weight of their silent gazes crushed her. She thought of her father, of the photographs she'd found upstairs, of the generations of secrets that had been buried in this house. Her hands clenched into fists. If I agree, will you leave them alone? The stranger inclined her head slightly, her veil shifting. For another year. Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. Then take me, but promise me this ends here. The stranger said nothing, but her presence seemed to loom larger, her shadow stretching across the room. Clara felt the temperature drop sharply as the woman reached out her hand again. This time Clara took it, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold leather of the stranger's glove. The fire in the hearth roared, and the room was filled with blinding light. Clara heard her family cry out, their voices breaking through their trance as the stranger's cold grip tightened on her hand. When the light faded, Clara was gone. The family sat in stunned silence, the warmth slowly returning to the room. The stranger's veil lay on the table, empty and still, as though she had never been there. And in the center of the table, the extra place setting remained untouched, the silver goblet glowing faintly in the dim light. The house was silent now, the warmth of the fire slowly fading to embers. Clara's family sat motionless around the dining table, their expressions a mixture of shock and grief. Her mother's trembling hands clutched the edge of the table as if it could anchor her to the moment. The extra place setting, still untouched, seemed to radiate an unnatural stillness. "Where's Clara?" her younger cousin whispered, his voice barely audible. No one answered. Her mother stood abruptly, knocking over her chair, and rushed to the door as if expecting to see Clara standing outside. But when she flung it open, there was only the blinding snowstorm swirling endlessly in the dark. Her father's voice broke the silence. She took her place," he muttered, his words heavy with guilt. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of the night's events crushing him. "What do you mean?" one of the aunts demanded, her voice rising in panic. "What place? What are you talking about?" The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight, each strike echoing through the house like a final toll. The sound seemed to shake the walls, and for a moment the lights flickered again. Her mother turned to face the table, her face pale and tear-streaked. "This house, it has its rules," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been this way for generations. The house demands a sacrifice every year. That's the price of keeping us safe." Her explanation only deepened the shock. The family erupted in disbelief, voices overlapping in confusion and anger. "What are you saying? This is madness. Why didn't you tell us?" But her mother didn't answer. She stared at the empty place setting, her expression hollow. Clara chose to save us, just like her father did, just like others before them. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the faint crackling of the dying fire. No one dared to speak again. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving the world outside pristine and eerily quiet. The family avoided the dining room, unwilling to face the haunting reminder of the night before. Clara's younger cousin wandered into the room, drawn to the table despite the warnings to stay away. He froze when he saw it. The silver goblet, once faintly glowing, was now tarnished and dull, as if the life had been drained from it. A single, delicate white lily rested on the plate, its petals soft and pristine despite the cold. "Clara's favorite flower," the boy whispered, tears welling in his eyes. The family eventually left the house, their belongings packed hastily, the warmth of the New Year's celebration replaced by a cold, lingering dread. The mansion stood empty, its towering silhouette casting long shadows over the snow. But deep within its halls, in the flickering light of the hearth that refused to die, the extra place setting remained, and somewhere in the house a soft, distant knock echoed just once before fading into silence. The house was waiting. The next year would come soon enough. Story 3, The Countdown Incident. The air was crisp, biting against Ben's face as he stood in the crowded town square, watching the large digital clock counting down the final minutes of the year. Strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed above, casting a warm glow over the celebration. Families huddled together, friends laughed over steaming cups of cider, and children darted through the crowd, their giggles blending with the distant sound of music. It was festive, cheerful, and everything Ben usually avoided. He tugged at his coat, wishing he'd stayed home. He didn't share the town's enthusiasm for New Year's Eve or its traditions. He had only come because of his sister Emma, who had practically dragged him out of his apartment. She stood beside him now, grinning as she watched the children's sparklers. "Come on, Ben," Emma said, nudging him playfully. "It's New Year's. At least pretend to enjoy yourself. Who knows? Maybe this is the year everything changes." Ben gave her a half-hearted smile. He doubted it. Life had a way of staying exactly the same, no matter how many clocks reset. He looked up at the digital clock towering over the square. 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes until midnight. 7 minutes until this charade would end and he could leave. As he stared at the clock, something caught his eye. A faint haze was creeping in from the edges of the square, soft and low, like the beginnings of an early morning fog. It was strange, too thick for this kind of cold night. Ben frowned, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the crowd remained oblivious, laughing and chatting as the haze slowly crept closer. "Do you see that?" Ben asked, nudging Emma. "See what?" she replied, looking around. "The fog. It's weird, isn't it?" Emma squinted, then shrugged. "It's just fog, Ben. Relax. Not everything has to be mysterious." But Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The haze wasn't natural. It moved too deliberately, as if it had a purpose. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. As the clock ticked down to 11:56 p.m., Ben tried to focus on the celebration, pushing the unease to the back of his mind. Emma laughed beside him, joking with a friend who had joined them, and for a moment Ben almost convinced himself he was imagining things. Then the music abruptly stopped. The square fell silent, the cheerful hum of voices replaced by a strange, heavy stillness. Ben looked up at the clock. The numbers flickered and glitched, freezing for a moment before continuing their countdown. The crowd murmured in confusion, glancing at each other nervously. Ben's eyes darted back to the haze. It had thickened, curling around the edges of the square like a living thing. He grabbed Emma's arm. "That's not normal," he said, his voice low but firm. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say a word, the clock flickered again. The last thing Ben saw before the square was plunged into complete darkness was the numbers freezing at 11:59 p.m. The square was engulfed in darkness, the kind so deep and heavy it felt like the world had vanished. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he clutched Emma's arm, his eyes straining to see through the pitch-black void. The murmurs of the crowd rose to panicked whispers, voices calling out for loved ones, the confusion thick and contagious. "Ben," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely steady. "Just stay close to me." A faint flicker of light returned, but it was weak and unsteady, as though the town square was struggling to pull itself back into reality. The strings of festive lights buzzed and blinked sporadically, casting eerie shadows on the crowd. The digital clock above the square remained frozen at 12 o'clock a.m., its numbers glowing faintly, as if mocking the frozen moment. The haze was closer now, curling around the edges of the square like a silent predator. It swallowed the outermost buildings and streetlights, leaving only the center of the square visible. The air felt heavier, colder, and an eerie silence pressed down on them, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from a broken speaker. Ben turned in a slow circle, scanning the crowd. Something about the people seemed off. Most stood frozen, their faces blank, staring at nothing. Others murmured to themselves, soft and incoherent, as if they were reciting something under their breath. "What are they doing?" Emma asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Ben said. "We need to get out of here." He tried to lead her toward the edge of the square, but the haze stopped them. It wasn't just fog, it was thick, impenetrable, and cold, like walking into an invisible wall. Through the haze, Ben thought he could see shadows moving, shapes that didn't belong. They were tall and spindly, their movements quick and jerky, flickering in and out of view. Emma gasped, pulling him back. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "I saw," Ben said, his throat dry. "We're not going that way." A loud metallic screech pierced the air, drawing their attention back to the clock. The numbers flickered, glitched, and then nothing. It went completely dark. The crowd's murmurs turned into panicked shouts as people began moving in all directions, their confusion escalating into fear. Ben spotted a man near the clock, his outline barely visible in the flickering light. He was tall, dressed in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. Something about him made Ben's skin crawl, but the man didn't move with the panic of the others. He stood still, watching, as if waiting for something. "Who is that?" Emma asked, her voice tight. Ben didn't answer. He didn't know, but every instinct in his body told him to stay away. The man turned his head toward them as though he had heard Emma's question. His voice rang out, calm and commanding, cutting through the chaos. "The clock must be reset," he said, "before it's too late." Ben and Emma exchanged a glance. The man began walking toward them, his steps deliberate and unhurried. "You must find it," the man continued, his voice impossibly clear despite the growing noise. "The real clock, the one that keeps time for this place." "What are you talking about?" Ben demanded, his voice cracking. "What clock? What is happening here?" The man stopped a few feet away, his face still obscured by shadow. "Time has stopped," he said simply, "and if it is not restored, the fog will consume everything. Find the clock or be lost to it." Before Ben could question him further, the man turned and vanished into the haze, leaving behind only the echo of his words. Ben stared at the spot where the man had disappeared, his mind racing. "What do we do?" Emma asked, her voice tight with fear. Ben clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "We find that clock," he said, "whatever it takes." Ben led Emma through the panicked crowd, his eyes darting toward the edges of the square where the haze crept closer with every passing moment. The man's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. Find the clock or be lost to it. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew standing still wasn't an option. "Where do we even start?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Ben scanned the square, his gaze landing on the old town hall at the far side. Its dark silhouette loomed over the chaos, its once proud clock tower now eerily still and silent. "There," he said, pointing. "If there's a clock that controls whatever this is, it has to be in there." Emma hesitated, glancing toward the haze. "Do you really think it's safe?" "Nowhere is safe," Ben replied, grabbing her hand. "Come on." As they moved, the crowd's behavior grew stranger. People stood frozen mid-step, their faces devoid of emotion, as if they had been paused in time. Others whispered in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made Ben's skin crawl. At the edge of the square, they encountered a group of people staring into the haze. Their eyes were wide and vacant, their lips moving soundlessly. One by one, they stepped into the fog and disappeared, their forms swallowed whole without a trace. "Don't look," Ben said, pulling Emma's gaze away. They reached the town hall's heavy wooden doors and pushed them open. The interior was dark, lit only by the dim glow of the haze pressing against the tall windows. The air was thick and cold, and the faint sound of ticking echoed through the empty halls. "What is this place?" Emma whispered, her voice bouncing off the high ceilings. Ben didn't answer. He followed the sound of ticking, leading them deeper into the building. They passed through corridors lined with old, faded portraits and dusty furniture, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The ticking grew louder as they entered a small room at the back of the building. In the center of the room, stood an ancient clock, its brass frame tarnished and covered in intricate carvings. The hands were frozen at 12 o'clock a.m., just like the digital clock in the square. "This has to be it," Ben said, stepping closer. Emma hung back, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "What do we do now?" Ben reached out to touch the clock, but the moment his fingers brushed the cold brass, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. "Ben," Emma said, her voice shaking, "something's wrong." Before he could respond, the shadows coalesced into tall, spindly figures with glowing eyes. They moved jerkily, like puppets on strings, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. They surrounded the clock, their glowing eyes fixed on Ben and Emma. The whispering started again, this time louder and more insistent, the words incomprehensible but filled with malice. "They don't want us to fix it," Emma said, backing away. Ben gritted his teeth. "We don't have a choice." The figures began closing in, their movements quick and erratic. Ben grabbed the clock's winding key, his hands trembling as he tried to turn it. The key resisted, as if the clock itself was fighting him. "Hurry!" Emma shouted, her voice rising in panic. The figures lunged forward, their shadowy forms reaching for Ben. Emma grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at them, the impact scattering the shadows temporarily. "Do it now!" she yelled. Ben put all his strength into turning the key. With a loud click, the clock's hands began to move. The figures let out a piercing, otherworldly screech, their forms disintegrating into the air like smoke. The room trembled as the clock struck 12:01 a.m., its chime reverberating through the building. The haze outside the windows began to recede, and the air grew warmer. Ben and Emma stood frozen, their breaths ragged, as the echoes of the clock's chime faded into silence. The ancient clock's chime reverberated one last time, its low toll lingering in the air before fading into an eerie silence. Ben and Emma stood motionless, their chests heaving as they tried to process what had just happened. The shadows were gone, the room still, but the uneasy feeling in the air remained. Ben turned to Emma. "We did it," he said, his voice trembling. Emma shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Then why does it still feel wrong?" As if in answer, the room began to shift again. The walls groaned, the wood creaking under an invisible weight. A low, resonating hum filled the air, and the faint sound of a distorted countdown began to echo through the hallways. 10, 9, 8. Ben's stomach twisted. No, that can't be. The clock before them began to glow faintly, its hands ticking forward but moving erratically, as if struggling against something unseen. The intricate carvings along its brass frame shimmered, revealing shapes that seemed to writhe and twist, faces frozen in silent screams. "We didn't stop it," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "We only started something worse." A sudden gust of icy wind blew through the room, extinguishing the faint glow of the haze outside the windows. The darkness outside seemed alive, pressing against the glass like a living entity. The door to the room slammed shut, trapping them inside. The distorted countdown grew louder, more insistent, as though it were coming from the clock itself. 7, 6, 5. "What do we do?" Emma shouted, panic rising in her voice. Ben's mind raced. He stared at the clock, its hands twitching as if in pain. "The key," he said suddenly. "Maybe we need to stop it. Wind it backward or something." He grabbed the key and tried to turn it in the opposite direction, but it wouldn't budge. The clock seemed to resist his efforts, its carvings glowing brighter, the screaming faces twisting as if alive. The countdown continued. 4, 3. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against their chests like an invisible weight. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows around them stretching and writhing. Emma grabbed Ben's arm, her voice frantic. "Ben, it's not working. We're running out of time." Desperation overtook him. He slammed his fist against the clock, shouting, "What do you want?" The distorted countdown faltered for a moment, the echoing voice responding with a single word: "Choose." Ben froze, the word reverberating in his mind. "Choose?" he repeated, his voice shaky. The clock's carvings shifted, revealing two paths etched into its surface. One path led to a glowing 12:01 a.m., while the other twisted back to 11:59 p.m. The choice was clear: move forward or turn back. Emma's grip on his arm tightened. "We have to move forward, Ben. If we go back, we'll be stuck in this forever." Ben hesitated, his hand hovering over the clock's key. The distorted countdown resumed, now slower and more menacing. 2. With a deep breath, he turned the key toward 12:01 a.m. The clock let out a deafening chime, its glow intensifying until the room was bathed in blinding light. The distorted voices screamed in protest, the shadows disintegrating into nothingness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the light faded, and the room returned to its original state. The haze outside the windows was gone, the air warm and still. The clock stood motionless, its hands now perfectly aligned at 12:01 a.m. Ben and Emma collapsed to the floor, their breaths ragged. The countdown was gone, the fog was gone, but the unease in their chests remained. Ben helped Emma to her feet, their eyes meeting in shared relief and exhaustion. "It's over," he said, though the words felt hollow. Emma nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I hope so." The faint glow of the town square greeted Ben and Emma as they stepped out of the town hall, their footsteps echoing in the now eerily quiet streets. The haze was gone, and the once panicked crowd was now back to celebrating as if nothing had happened. Laughter and cheers filled the air, and the digital clock above the square read 12:01 a.m., its numbers glowing bright and steady. Ben scanned the crowd, his heart heavy with unease. The faces he saw were animated and cheerful, but something felt wrong, off, like watching a play where the actors didn't fully understand their roles. Emma tugged on his sleeve. "Look," she whispered, nodding toward the square. The man in the dark coat and wide-brimmed hat stood near the clock, his figure blending into the shadows. He watched the crowd with an unnerving stillness, his face hidden, as always. Ben's fists clenched. "You knew this would happen," he said under his breath, though he wasn't sure if the man could hear him. As if in response, the man turned his head slightly, acknowledging them. He raised a gloved hand and tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like a warning than gratitude. Before Ben could move, the man stepped into the shadows and disappeared, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke. Emma shivered. What was he? Was he even human? "I don't know," Ben admitted, his voice low. "But whatever he was part of this thing." The siblings stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Around them, the crowd erupted into cheers again, celebrating as if nothing had happened. Ben's eyes drifted to the digital clock, its bright display now an unwelcome reminder of everything they had endured. As they turned to leave the square, a familiar sound made them freeze. A faint, distorted voice echoed from somewhere deep in the shadows. 10, 9, 8. Ben's chest tightened, and he grabbed Emma's hand. "Let's go," he said firmly. They walked away from the square, their steps quick and deliberate. But even as they left, the countdown echoed faintly in the back of their minds, a haunting reminder that their escape might not be as complete as they hoped. Back at home, Ben stared at the clock on his wall. The hands ticked forward normally, each movement steady and predictable. But he couldn't shake the feeling that time itself had shifted, that something had changed. As the town square grew quiet, the digital clock blinked once, its numbers flickering briefly before resetting to 11:59 p.m. The faint sound of the countdown began again, lost to the stillness of the night. Time had moved forward, but the cycle wasn't broken. The fog would return, and the clock would demand its price once more,